For those of us who have grown up in the church, we probably all have a story about how a hymn has deeply affected us, perhaps during a tough time in our own life or some special event, but something about that hymn, a line of text, perhaps the melody or harmony, reached down deep inside of us and seized us in a way that has shaped us. Perhaps no hymn has done this more than Amazing Grace, which seems undeniably wedded to the heart of American culture in a way that no other song has been, and certainly in a way that no other hymn has. The impact has been immense. It has been included on more than 11,000 albums, including such performers as Johnny Cash and Aretha Franklin, and most recently, Andrea Bocelli ended his pandemic Easter special, Music for Hope, singing the song a cappella standing outside the Duomo di Milano in Italy, by himself to an empty plaza in front of the cathedral, in a deeply moving moment that for millions around the world captured both their fear and focused their hope. It's difficult to imagine a hymn that has been more deeply ingrained in American culture and one that has transcended the role normally ascribed for a church hymn. It raises some questions. What about this hymn has made it such a source of comfort? How did this hymn, written by an Anglican priest, become so rooted in American culture? And how did this hymn become such an anthem in the African American community, becoming such a key part of the civil rights movement? These questions and more swirl around the amazing history and impact of Amazing Grace. Perhaps we should start at the beginning. It's a story that seems almost too crazy to be true. John Newton, former slave trader turned abolitionist through religious conversion, a wild, untamed youth, his mother passing away while he was still a boy. Newton growing up as a sailor on his father's ship, then press-ganged into the British Navy. After attempting desertion, he was lashed, reduced in rank, chained, and then eventually traded to another ship. Then abandoned in West Africa to a slave trader and lemon tree plantation owner, who then gave Newton to his wife, who was an African princess. He was rescued by another sea captain, apparently sent looking for him by his father, and then a religious conversion in the middle of a terrible storm that ended in a seemingly miraculous survival. John Newton credits this moment as a point of transition in his life. Popular culture has presented the story as a kind of Saul and Tarsus moment where in the blink of an eye, a life was turned 180 degrees in a different direction. But the truth is a bit more complicated and quite a bit more gradual. In reality, he continued to support the slave trade, making 3 more voyages as a captain of a slave vessel. And in 1754, after suffering a stroke, he retired, but yet continued to invest financially in the slave trade. In 1764, he was ordained as an Anglican priest, and hymn writing became an important part of his ministry, writing more than 280 hymns. Amazing Grace was written in 1772. But it was not until 1788, 16 years, an eternity after he wrote Amazing Grace, and 24 long years after he became an Anglican priest, that he published the pamphlet entitled Thoughts upon the Slave Trade, where he described the terrible conditions present on a slave ship and made an apology for so many years of being a supporter and economic benefactor from slavery. He wrote, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection for me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." The pamphlet was popular and influential, subject to several reprints, and was distributed to members of Parliament. The English civil government would outlaw slavery in 1807 while John Newton was still alive. And John Newton's witness was a key important factor. John Newton was a bad person, and he didn't get better. for a long, long time. And then he did. And then he made all the difference. Let's talk a little bit about the text in the hymn. The most famous line is probably the first. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I think you can probably all hear the melody when I speak that text. Wretch seems a bit harsh. It's from the Old English word recca, or a person in exile, banished, a stranger. There's no doubt that Newton saw his past life as a wretched, or even perhaps wrecked, and he knew what it meant to be saved. The text speaks of the joy and sheer relief, and perhaps even release of a soul truly lifted out of despair. The text is unabashedly personal and individual, and constantly in the first person. The hymn is not about us. It's about the individual. However, I think the individuality of the language has made the hymn so personal. People feel the song speaking to them personally. And it speaks most deeply to those that have experienced deep grief and have felt hopelessness and despair. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. It's the home part, I think, that matters. Home is where the family is. It's where our loved ones are. It's where we feel safe. Home, our ultimate home. I think this song is about home, here on earth and in heaven. The tune we now associate with the hymn is New Britain, an Appalachian folk tune. And this is not the tune that Amazing Grace would have originally been sung to, but it became popular in the United States, probably by singing masters teaching in singing schools in the early 19th century. It appeared in 1829 for the first time, paired together without attribution and without any known earlier written versions. One possible person who perhaps transcribed the tune, transitioning it from folk song to published hymn, is Lucius Chapin, part of the first family of American hymn tune writers and singing masters, who in 1828, a year before it first appeared in print, wrote the tune out in a letter. Perhaps Chapin was the first to take this popular song and bring it into history. The Psalter Hymnal Handbook writes that the tune had an early history of grace notes and melodic embellishments typical of Appalachian folk music. And when you look at the transcription of the tune by Lucius Chapin, you can see that he was notating some of this ornamentation. Our modern version was harmonized by Edwin O. Excel, a singing school teacher, song leader, soloist, and eventually publisher of hymnals and songbooks in the later part of the 19th century. You can hear in his arrangement some of these grace notes and passing tones that clearly had become central to the singing of the early folk tune. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch. And you can hear and kind of imagine that some of those notes wouldn't have necessarily been original, but became eventually part of the tradition of singing that song. The soulful sound of the tune is also the result of the pentatonic scale that forms the basis of this melody. Now, the pentatonic scale, a 5-tone scale using the configuration of the black keys on the piano, provides a kind of sadness and soulfulness that is neither major nor minor, both hopeful and sad at the same time, leading to the idea of grace saving us from despair. No one captured this better than Aretha Franklin in her famous rendition that used this tonality and melodic freedom to express these words in a way that cut to the heart of Newton's words. Isn't that remarkable? It's just amazing, capturing the heart of that song. But my favorite version of Amazing Grace is not one performed by a professional singer, but by President Obama seeking to give meaning to unspeakable tragedy at the memorial service for Clementa Pinckney, one of the victims of the church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. We have many fine recordings of this hymn, but in this one, we can see how the hymn can be used to express unspeakable grief and lead others toward hope of a better world. A hope for home.
Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved